Good afternoon. My name is Mary Dockin, Vice President of Outreach at Intellispark. And on behalf of Intellispark and School Counselor Central, I'm delighted to welcome you to today's webinar on student support for the new school year. The well-being of students is central to our work at Intellispark. We believe student support is a team sport and that kids thrive when they're known, appreciated, and supported. Intellispark is an innovative technology platform that combines quick check surveys, positive feedback, and team collaboration tools that help you support every student. We work with over 300 schools and programs across the country and invite you to join us at no cost with Intellispark Starter Edition by visiting intellispark.com and requesting an account for your school. Our guests today for today's discussion are Deborah Hardy and Liberatore, no strangers to the School Counselor Central and Intellispark webinar series. Deb is the founder of School Counselor Central with over 25 years of experience as a school counselor and a former K-12 school counseling services director in New York. Currently, she works as a consultant and provides school counselor training to develop support for all students by embracing the whole child approach and personalized learning. Matt is the founder and clinical psychotherapist at Luminary Solutions. As a past president of the Illinois School Counselor Association and a school and district leader, Matt has developed a passion for utilizing student achievement data to drive and leverage student success within education. Deb and Matt are adjunct faculty members helping to train the next generation of school counselors and serve as senior advisors to the work we do here at Intellispark. As the new school year begins, there are widespread concerns regarding the student support needed for students to feel that they belong to their school community and are engaged in their learning. We're excited for Matt and Deb to discuss this critical and timely topic with us today. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping details. The format for today's webinar will be a discussion amongst colleagues. We've prepared some questions for Deb and Matt on student support, and I invite you to share the questions you have during our conversation utilizing the Q&A. You are also welcome to share comments via the chat box. Although we're not all physically in a room together, we're excited that you've joined us for this discussion. One of my colleagues will assist us today and post information in the chat box and resources such as how you can connect with Deb, Matt, and Intellispark. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to you along with a certificate of attendance. We hope you will share the recording with colleagues who are unable to attend today. And with that, let's begin the discussion. Matt and Deb, welcome. We're so glad you're here.
Glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, glad to be here. Thank you so much.
Well, I want to start with the first question, and we'll start with you, Matt. As we think about this new year and have coming off of the last school year, how can schools rethink the way to support students as we return, hopefully, to more in-person learning?
Yeah, just right off the bat, it brings me to, all the changes and innovation that I saw school counselors or district administrators doing last year. I saw so many creative techniques around, freshman orientations or finding ways to connect students or to engage students. And I think really trying to reflect on those practices and bring those forward into this new school year. And I always say, we didn't just do those things because we're in a pandemic. We did those things because they helped students. And so how can we really capture those things that worked best and were more innovative than what we were doing prior to this and bring that forward? And then the other piece of that I'll just kind of tap onto is really looking at our outside partnerships. I know prior to the pandemic, everyone had obviously a resource list of outside partnerships. And I think the only way we're going to be able to partner together and continue to handle the mental health crisis that we're going to go under as far as what's needed and who needs support is really doing this as a community. And so I think everybody's going to have to really do an audit and reevaluate some of those outside resources, and even kind of reconnecting with outside resources to find out, what's available, what are they doing during this time too, to help support families and community, and how can we make that synergy between school and community to support students as a whole.
It's interesting you share that, because that's one of the things as we work together with Intellispark, the importance of that care team around each and every student, and that the center being the school, but that connection to the community being important, and how can we make that easy for all concerned so that the work is on that human endeavor. So, Deb, what are your thoughts, and what would you add?
I agree with everything Matt said. I would add that I'm very oriented towards data, always was as a director of school counseling. I like to see what the students are thinking and what are trends that are in our community, especially these past years. I'm sure data is going to come flowing in on the need. So looking at the information that counselors can get from their families and students to align the delivery of their program accordingly, right? And I love the idea of collaborating with outside support systems, because we're not going to be all able to do it by ourselves or in our staffing environment. And then the second thing that I think is essential, but it should be priority for every school, is building connections and relationships. We have adults, students, all of us have not been reconnecting for years. And you're seeing your faces or masked faces for the first time in a long time, possibly, or being in the building every day. So it is extremely important, in my opinion, that connections and relationships be the essence of every program, including curriculum.
Yeah.
Well, and one of the things I read recently was an article about just even the importance on the first day of school. And I know some on this call, maybe the first day of school has already started, but just welcoming each and every student returning to in-person learning with a smile and being front and center and visible, and just how important that will be. So, what do you think are the most crucial beginning steps for students' success as they return to school and that in-person learning? What would you, if you were sitting down advising one of your students or meeting with a student and parent, what do you think those beginning steps are?
I'll be happy to start. I think we as counselors have to take a real in-depth look at the curriculum and that we deliver, and look at what are some of the themes. We tend to create, obviously, a school counseling program based on traditional relationships, et cetera, topics. But we now have to look at it differently. I think we have to look at what coping skills are we providing students, right? As well as families, not just students themselves, but through our student support staff or team, what are we trying to have families obtain? What kind of coping skills? Do they know how to address being remote or being isolated, or losing friends, not having the social engagement that they had before? To me, that would be important. I probably would start there.
Okay.
And just to add, as we talk about it in Intellispark, students are supported in 3 pillars, in the school system, at home, in the family, and then also in community. And so I think it's really crucial that we're asking, either through survey or through some type of assessment, really trying to assess and ascertain how connected students are. whether they have a key connection at home in the family, do they have a key connection in the community, and then do they feel supported at school? And I think when you assess and you audit that, you can actually look at who are the students you're needing to connect first. Who do you have to support first? Because they're the ones not connected. And as we sit here and talk about connection being key, I think it's crucial that we're finding out who is connected and who is not, and then supporting them from that angle. And to Deb's point about customizing curriculum, you're customizing curriculum to connect those students and to find them a way to feel supported.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And I know in a conversation with a school counselor from Wisconsin, he shared the work that they were doing and by utilizing surveys, and he happens to use surveys in the Intellispark tool, but it was uncovering some things that were very interesting, where students that were perceived to be doing well weren't, students that were perceived to feel connected weren't. Yeah. And, his comment was, we can so easily walk right by these students and not be aware. And we really need to ask them, right? We need to know who they are. So I think really appreciate those comments. So, as we talk about learning and sort of that practical application, how do we connect the learning to everyday life? I noticed in the poll, there's an emphasis on the academics, and I'm thinking of my own children. I'm thinking of myself, and I would describe myself as a practical learner, that I loved reading as a student, but I really learned by doing. And I'd love your thoughts about how do we connect that learning to everyday life for our students, and how do we think about the academic and the social and emotional learning? Matt, do you want to give that a go?
Yeah, I think, when we speak from an SEL standpoint, the more and more I work with schools, or I talk to individuals who are taking on, what is this SEL? It's to get people to understand that this is everywhere, right? SEL isn't the, canned curriculum that the counselor drives by with. And it's not just a one period during the day, but SEL is something that's infused in everything we do. In the math class, part of you actually, being challenged and working through that challenge and finding resiliency through being successful through that challenge is all part of an SEL process that needs to be captured and articulated, right? As opposed to, oh, I'm frustrated with this and I'm not going to be successful. And so I think really getting everybody in the school system to understand that every single subject and in every part of the learning can be connected to SEL. I in the private practice, I deal with 45-year-old adults who can't name a feeling, and I always laugh at that in a good way, because I'm always like, where was that class in third grade? How to name feelings and how to articulate them and how to communicate them. And so I think any adult in the building who really sits and stops and connects to a student and asks them how they're doing and asks them how they're feeling and encourages them and connects them, I think is doing their part with the SEL. And I think that's how it becomes part of every day. It's part of who we are and how we interface with students.
Deb, what are your thoughts?
One word: applicability. How do I apply what I learned? And I saw this come out more this past year with my clients. I service about 120 high school students. And when I meet with them, I get to do school counseling without the school, which I love, because I get to do all the things I always wanted to do as a school counselor, but in that frame of time within the constraints of a school schedule, I wasn't able to do. So, for example, learning about the students' interests and connecting it to skills they have. So today I talked to someone about video games, and the parents, of course, have their eyes coming out like, oh, they love to play video games, but they also are very good with math. And so we started to talk about which math course, again, curriculum going in, and looking at strategy and how much they love strategy, or why they were successful in chemistry, and where they fell apart with English. Like Matt said, throw the SEL there. They can't convey emotions. They can't. You can't even write about it. They can write about the logistical stuff, but not the emotional stuff. And recalling my time in school district, I don't know when, I'm going to be honest here, I had the time to spend with kids to really delve into who they are, what they're successful at, what they like in details, right? I got the surface, but not in details. So then their issue is, how do I apply what I've learned? I want to know how to do financial management things. I have a lot of kids that they're investing in the stock market and doing quite well with their parents' support. And had I been in a school system, I would have never known that, right? Because you're in, out kind of thing. And they are looking to use their skills they're learning, or they have, outside in the real world. And I think applicability is the essence of it.
Well, and I would just add that those colleagues joining us, if you have examples that you want to share, please put them in the chat box so we can be learning from each other. One of the things that we talk about in our work is really the importance to know the name, face, and story of each student. And you've already talked about the importance, as we think of student support, that it begins with a relationship. It's hard to learn if you don't feel connected. As you think about all of that, what are ways that you could recommend schools, educators, to think about getting to know their students? Deb, would you want to start?
My first reaction is get rid of all the non-counseling tasks, right? And everybody's going to applaud right now. But seriously, I think we have to pause. We talk about the time and task analysis that we're all supposed to be doing. And often I heard, well, why do I have to validate what I do, right? And explain what I do. And it really isn't about validation or explanation. It's about how connected do you get to your students when you look at your time and task. If you are spending way too much time on non-counseling activities and you're missing the boat with the kids, that's essential right there to show what the issues are with students, and how your program and your connection, developing a personalized learning plan with each kid is so important, so that the kids feel connected and so we can help their emotional growth.
Matt, what are your thoughts, or some examples, things that you've used in the work you've done that have been?
Yeah, I'll think of a couple of them. And, I know a building principal who was working to find, which students were connected or not connected. And they put up the picture of every student, and had every staff member, gave them the stickies, and actually gave them sticky dots. And if they felt like they were connected to a student, they put up the sticky dots on the picture. And at the end, it gave a very graphic representation of which students had the most connections and which students were least connected. The challenge I have with that exercise is I've seen it done a few times actually, and no one does anything afterwards with it. They say, oh, these students aren't connected. These students aren't connected. And I'm always like, well, how are we leveraging this information, right? How are we using this data to then go out and support and connect students in a different way? And then how are we bringing it back to reassess to see if what we did is actually working or not? And so, I do know, like in Intellispark, in the platform that we use, there's tons of ways and surveys in there to find ways to be connected. And that's why I'm trying to challenge people to say, make sure you're assessing your work that you do that way. Another way that I saw people being really successful with is like, because of social distance or social proximity, they couldn't do the freshman orientation with, 300 kids or 400 kids at one time. And so they did it in smaller groups, and counselor had 10 of their own students in, and just did a smaller 20-minute session. And I heard wonderful success because they felt like they were able to have a more personal conversation. They were able to get to know their students better. And so I always kind of chuckle at that, because now it's like, oh, well, now we can have groups back together again. Let's go back to the old way. And I'm like, well, what did we learn from that way, that actually changed things up and helped you to feel way more connected to your freshmen coming in than, when we brought them all in at 400 at a time. And so I think really looking at ways to make groups more smaller and more personalized. And I think to capitalize on what Deb said is really looking at these individualized personal learning plans right from the get-go when they walk in the building. Like, start adding things, interests and strengths and likes and dislikes right from the get-go. So you're actually building this portfolio on a student as they go with you.
Mary, can I just also
Yes. Yep.
something that came out that I thought was phenomenal was the fact that counselors were building their little virtual offices, right?
Yep.
Great to have that. I think the piece, having said it was great, let me play devil's advocate. We need to ask kids how they used it, because often, the clients would say, my clients would say to me, I love it, but there's so much there because we try to pack everything in there, and not just counselors, teachers, everybody, packing so much in these virtual offices that the kids felt disconnected. So ask your kids, which part did you like? Which part didn't you like? Keep it. Is this a good resource? I thought it was ingenious that they did it, but it could have, maybe now it's time to readdress what was used and what's valuable. That's all.
Yep. Yeah.
No, and one of the things that I know I've heard from teachers has been, and counselors, that keeping it simple and kind of to the point. When there's too much information or too much choice, sometimes we don't take advantage of anything. Sort of, studies have been done, on that, and I think that can really apply here. The other thing I would just add is more for food for thought, because as you were talking about this, how do we get to know our students? I was also reflecting on both my own experience as a learner, and also as somebody that was in the school working with students. And one thing that I recall doing was asking students, and this could be electronically or, on a note card, but to say, tell me something that I wouldn't necessarily know about you. Mm-hmm. So that I can, that you'd like to share, that you'd feel comfortable sharing. And that really made a connection, because you knew something that they felt important about sharing. And that was also a question that I know a counselor using the Get to Know Me survey said that he had been meeting with a ninth grade student. His head was in his hands, kind of looking down, but he had looked at that survey and learned that to this young man, his family was really important. So all of a sudden he could ask that question and the whole demeanor changed. So, well, we've talked about the individualized learning plans, and it's clear that, our colleagues joining us, many are developing those. I would love to know your thoughts on how schools can create those plans to celebrate the activities and accomplishments of students. And, Matt, start with you. What have you seen? What might be some examples or ways to think about, if you're building it from the beginning or you already have something, but how can you focus on that, the interests and activities and abilities of the students as a part of that plan?
Well, I think I'm a little biased because I really love the Intellispark program, and it was obviously created with that in mind, because I do feel like options are limited. And when I say options are limited, I think there's things out there. What comes to mind is I remember the perpetual 4-year plan that I would do with students, and it was a static document that just sat somewhere, and nobody revisited it, or you did revisit it if you had time, but everybody knows that no one ever has the time because we're in triage mode. And I think, given the fact that it's only going to get, more demanding as far as our time goes with everything that's coming, that whatever it is, whatever you decide and you pick and you choose, I'm really passionate about the fact that this has to be something that's dynamic. And when I say dynamic, it's something that's living and breathing, that changes all the time, that the student engages with. Because I think at the end of the day, that's when it becomes meaningful, right? That's when it's something meaningful. And when something's meaningful, that's when somebody will spend and take the time to use it and to actually fill it out. And so to your point, I'm a big strengths-based counselor. So let's look at what you're great at and let's build on that, or let's, have more of it. And so the same thing, how are we cataloging and documenting a student's strengths so that when they are met with challenges, that we're able to leverage those strengths to help them succeed and overcome. Same thing. How are we seeing and finding what someone's interested in? To your point, what you just said there about, what's something that no one else knows about you, that should be in the individualized student's plan so that other people can connect with them on that common element. Because, a student's life is like an iceberg. In the school system, we only see what's at the top, and we don't see everything else in the bottom. And so my belief and philosophy behind an individualized learning plan is it helps start to fill out the bottom of the iceberg. Because the more that we can see that, the more that we can help students and we can help them to be successful.
That's a great visual picture. Deb, what are your thoughts? I know you in the counseling that you did in schools as well as in your private practice, you're working a lot on those interests and activities and abilities that students have.
Yeah, hard to follow what Matt said. Totally. Well said. Being in the school system, one of the hardest things to handle was that there was a flavor of the month for a new product that came out, right? And the question we always wanted to ask was, will we use it? What are we going to use it for? And what are we missing in the other pieces that we don't have with these new pieces, or that these pieces will give us? So we kept using the student management system. I remember at one point a new program came in for MTSS and RTI. It didn't last very long because it didn't do everything. It didn't tell the full story of the student. And then you had way too many logins across the board with too many programs, and we never saw the story. All we were doing was inputting data all the time, and we didn't have time to talk to teachers. We didn't have time or to collaborate with teachers, et cetera. So it was all right, very reactive. And like Matt, I am biased. I remember when I just recently was seeing the Intellispark and what it does, I was like, wow, where was this when I was in a school district? Because you have a dashboard of your students celebrating, identifying issues, setting action plan. Everything is in one location. And then also getting to know the student, right? So I know that we used a college tool that had a lot of surveys in there. And I used to ask my counselors, middle school and high school, because middle school used it too for their purposes for the career inventory. What do you do with this data that you have now on every student? Well, we did the career inventory, life goes on, as opposed to having rich conversations about, wow, let's talk about why engineering came up, or medicine, or lawyer, or whatever it might be. And how we're going to explore it. So, I'm going to push too, like Matt, and say, folks, you better get out there and take a look at what this tool does, because if I were in a district right now, I probably would be signing up in a second, because it tells the story and it's there. And it's a collaborative approach to working together.
Well, and I think just at the beginning, what's really important is as we do our work, and if that is the goal, collaboration, communication, it is really finding, how can we best do that? And, one of the things that we had the privilege last month of our guests were Anna Duvall and Dr. Chrissy Roddy, who had written a book on managing anxiety in school settings. And I think we've already talked about, or Matt, you've referenced that just what will be the mental health challenges as school returns, and for all grade levels. And I would just love your perspective on how can we think about the student support, the teams, in really helping students that may be struggling with that transition back, or realizing, in some cases, maybe they were planning and looking forward to in-person, and at the last minute, it will, not be what we'd all hoped it would be for them. What do you recommend? What strategies? And Deb, I'll start with you. How would you, if you were leading a support team, be talking about this with your team?
Oh, I'm reminiscing now because I oversaw the school counselors, the school social workers, school nurses. I didn't oversee the school psychologists, but I was a part of their team approach. I honestly believe that we all have our expertise, but we have to stop working in isolation and come together as a support team. And I've been saying this for eons. It's what I believe, because we have kids that may see school counselors and see school psychologists and whatnot. They see more than one staff member, so I call them over therapized, and the kids not improving along the way, right? So I think the challenge for the student support team is really to focus on what the needs of students are as they transition. So think of transition. We all do some kind of orientation in transition for incoming ninth graders, sixth graders, or elementary school. Let's make that broad. Everybody needs it. If they've been in the district or not for years, they need it, because they're going to be faced with social emotional issues, a lot of them. I'm sort of concerned about my graduate students who are going to go into New York City public schools, because especially in one given borough where there was a tremendous loss of teachers to the pandemic, and these kids now have to grieve. And they, for the first time, they're going to be back in an environment that's going to have a lot of loss and grieving to go through, not even talking about what they're going through home if they've lost family. So there's a lot of social, emotional pieces in addition to reconnecting face to face with adults and other students. Just a few things.
Sure. Matt, what would you add? And I know you're coming off having served in that role over multiple high schools, and
one of my favorites when we do a school of refusal is, I said, get creative with the schedule. If a student's having heightened anxiety on Sundays coming back to the school week, create a support seminar first period on Monday, where they're not going into math class or their most challenging subject. And, some of the anxiety that's heightened on Sunday night is actually thinking about going to that class on Monday morning. Create a support seminar where there's a team of people sitting down and going to do goal planning and give them a granola bar or a nutritious meal when they first walk in on Monday. Have them, get them to the point where they're sitting there on Sunday evening and they're actually like excited about where they're going to head first thing Monday morning. And so I tell people to be creative with the schedule, be creative with what kind of programs you're designing and why you're designing them, and track to see if they're successful. If you have a support seminar that Monday morning for those who are doing school refusal, track and see if it's being successful. And if it's not successful, change up the program. Offer a different granola bar or something like that. I say it in jest, but there's some seriousness to that. Find out what's hooking them and what's going to get them to come there. And then the other part, and this is the clinician in me, is like, do a DBT skills class. And when I say DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, mindfulness, breathing, those are some basic strategies and skills no one learns about, doing some meditation. There's so many. I love the fact that we have like a Headspace app now that puts meditation in simple terms that people can be introduced to it. I self-disclose, and I wasn't 35. I was 35 years old before I actually figured out how to meditate. I thought it was shutting off my brain. And so for 20 years, I would sit there, and since I can't shut this brain off for 20 years, I'd end up throwing meditation off to the side and never go back to it again. Well, that's not what it's about. It's about taking the time to be mindful and to just take that 5 minutes to yourself. Even if you're thinking about the shopping list, even if you're thinking about classes and you're stressed with classes, just taking that 5 minutes is actually a skill in itself. And so I think that's really, really crucial that we actually teach, mindfulness skills, and we do groups, and we do, and then the last bit I'll share on this, and this, Mary and Deb, is they're not problem solving teams anymore. They're solution finding teams. Right. And so how are we sitting down, instead of talking about students who have the problems or what their problem is? Why don't we talk about solutions and come up with solutions and keep coming up with solutions until we actually see a marker that shows change?
And Matt, just to piggyback on that solution, find the root cause of the problem.
Yes.
So that you can
Yeah. I do that with my grad students, root cause exercise. So I see where you're going there.
It's the grad professor in us.
I know. I love it.
Well, and I think the other thing is that, in education, we think about the individual, but we also work with groups of students. And there is this challenge to have that personalized individual approach when you're still working with the group. And so that ability to really instill in each learner the love for learning. Again, as a parent, I certainly wanted my daughters to be successful, but I said at the end of the day, if you love learning, that will carry you, because you will, that was my goal. Go to school loving learning, come home from school loving learning. So just my own food for thought there. As you think back to last year, and again, it was a year that maybe none of us hoped for or could predict all the reiterations depending on what part of the country we lived in. But were there common themes that you noticed about your students, things that as you think back that would characterize your thoughts about them from a student support perspective? Matt, I'll hand it off to you first. The common themes that I saw, it was interesting, at least from this last year of remote learning, is there were some students who were not engaged in person who became engaged. Mm-hmm. And so I thought that was actually really interesting, because there was a lot of anecdotal stories about students' ADHD, or, hard to get them to come to school. And now also in this remote environment, there were some students that were flourishing, right? And then some students who thrived in that social environment, right? And then all of a sudden, started struggling with the virtual learning. And so I think the biggest thing is really looking for our themes as far as trying to find a way to personalize the learning for every student, right? I would argue that if we're seeing a way one student thrives, then we need to find a way to keep that incorporated in their learning the next year. We shouldn't just say, oh, we're back, so we'll let them struggle again. Let's find ways to have them demonstrate learning in whichever way they can, and in whichever way is successful for them. I would agree. Deb, do you have more to add to that?
I would say self-awareness was the biggest theme for me, for the kids that I worked with and families. They got to know how they learn, like Matt explained, how they learn best. They got to know how important the social environment or a sense of community was for them. And they got to know their stress levels, how to reduce it. Not all of them, but a good number. So some established mindfulness, yoga. I had some established exercise routines in the basement, or start walking every day now that the dog was there and everybody got pets. Let's go with the animals, right? It became a routine. And some discovered creativity, right? So self-awareness. They were baking, making crafts, they were making masks, you name it. And it brings me back to when I was in school. I utilized, in looking for themes, I utilized success highways, success pathways, I think is through Scholar Centric. And the school had surveyed the kids at the high school to find out, because we had done the 40 developmental assets, which is a wonderful survey. So we knew what the issues could be in big, broad, but we wanted to see individual students. So we did the Scholar Centric survey, and we found how kids were connected to education, their stress level, their connection to community, motivation, well-being, and confidence in general. And by having the individual student information, we were able then to either create groups or create classroom activities, because if this was a broad theme of stress, which I think you'll see be the number one theme going back to school, we were able then to address it in preventive ways throughout the year, not just a one-shot, let's run an assembly and tell you you can be distressed by breathing. It's ongoing support and reminders. So, again, I tell folks out there that was a great tool. I missed that tool. That gave us a lot of information of how the kids thought, and I know it's part of Intellispark now. So it's a great source of information to really see what your kids are going to come in with.
Well, and I think it's a very strong example of the importance of having real information to work from, right? Yeah. It's not all based on intuition. It's based on, this is what the student is saying. And there's real research behind it. Those types of tools, I think, are invaluable. As students now are coming back, and I know both of you have either working with students returning to school or have colleagues that are returning back to school, but are the themes the same? Are there different things now as we think of this new school year? I'll just share from my own perspective that, probably it was 5 weeks ago, I thought, I was thinking of it as the post-COVID year. And then with everything that's happened, I thought, no, it no longer seems to me like we're going to think of this as post-COVID. It's the third school year in this journey of not knowing what's going to happen. So again, I would love to know if you see new themes.
I think it's honest. It's about the flexibility and adaptability to what's coming up. To your point, I think a lot of people, in May or June were thinking that the light was at the end of the tunnel, and then comes along another variant, and we're having to adapt to, do you wear masks, do you not wear masks, and there's some governor mandates and some not, and so I think really this is another iteration of last year, which is adaptability and being flexible and, taking the information and responding to it in a meaningful way that allows students to still be engaged and still be learning. And what that looks like, I think, is going to be different because, we've already experienced one shutting down school and going home to virtually learn. So I think we're going to see a lot more flexibility and adaptability. But I think the more that educators can, prepare students for that mindset is actually going to help with the success. Not trying to create any false pretenses as to what this is going to be or what it's not going to be, but just encouraging an adaptability mindset so that if the changes do occur, that people just kind of roll with it.
And so, as you describe that, it strikes me that we as the adults, we need to be practicing that mindset because we too are dealing with those changes. And, are there any thoughts you have about, we want that for our students, but are there ways in which we should be caring for ourselves as educators in this work, things that you would be recommending? Deb, do you want to?
Well, my first thought is breathe. Just breathe. Take a deep breath, with or without the mask, and really just don't carry the weight on the shoulder. That's one. And two, when Matt's talked about adaptability, we can't expect our students to do things like it was done before, right? That every homework assignment has to be in, because a student can't do every homework assignment if they just lost a grandparent to the pandemic or to the virus, right? You have to find that flexibility, define what learning is, and for lack of a better word, mastery. So you have to have these honest conversations, transparent conversations with your team, no longer in isolation, and build that MTSS resource box there that you can go to, to your community, that you can share with your team members. It is daunting. It is going to be difficult. Although I'm not in a school, I have an office. And so in a way, this is my classroom here. And I too have to adapt. When everything happened, I was already online for a lot of my clients. So to me, it was an easy transition. But you have to also be creative. Don't think like I'm doing all this work in vain. No. Be creative. Be creative, be adaptable, flexible, and just take time for yourself. I always tell everybody, and I have to follow that advice, take me time. Right? Set aside half an hour, set aside 10 minutes. I always have water, drink lots of water. It's good for you. Stay hydrated, and go for a walk, really go for a walk. So.
Well, and to your point though, Deb, that's what I think so funny is in the beginning of the pandemic, everybody started sharing their self-care plan. And I was kind of chuckling at that because I'm like, we don't need a pandemic to have a self-care plan. And I would argue that we should be modeling that everyone has a self-care plan 24/7, whether we're in a pandemic or not a pandemic. Because I think our ability and markers of showing how well we access that self-care plan show our present level of functioning. Yeah. And so I think, maybe that is an SEL exercise, creating a self-care plan and what options are there. Because I think sometimes people don't even know what to put on there. For me, I'll be honest, I read for 15 minutes every time, about 8:00 in the morning, I read for 15 minutes, no matter how busy things are, I read because I always feel accomplished after I read. And so I know by adding 15 minutes, and even if it's just 15 minutes, that I already feel successful by starting my day, regardless of what else happens, regardless how stressful things are. I was successful because I read, and I really like reading, and I made time for that, no matter how busy things are, because who can't fit 15 minutes in of something?
Well, and that's really a life skill for us as adults to think about, mm-hmm. and then also to help the students we're serving, whether they're a kindergartner to a 12th grader, of how do we learn those flexibility skills? Like, how do we give ourselves as you said, Deb, breathe and pause. Matt, you said read. I would, earlier when we first began, both of you talked about the importance of the community resources, right? And schools don't have to solve this all themselves. I mean, it's the heart, right? And if as we think about this, and we're coming to the conclusion here of our hour, and it's certainly gone by very fast, but I would love any ideas, anything that you've seen in your own communities, or examples that you might point to in how that partnership could be. We've talked about the mental health therapist, but I know, Matt, in your district, there were a lot of community partnerships of all shapes and sizes.
Yeah, I mean, when we discuss career pathways, there wasn't a career pathway in our district that didn't have a community partner, that would be some type of workplace learning experience, where students would actually be able to go out. And this wasn't just a job shadow experience. I always am really cautious to tell people this isn't just a job shadow where someone goes and stands around somebody for a day, but an actual on-the-job learning experience where they were working, where they were getting a taste of what that job would be like. And so we would have our community partners within the industry in every career pathway. And it was really beneficial to them because they could actually, create a footprint of talent before they were even walking out the doors. And it was really important for us because it allowed students, a place to kind of experiment and exposure to the career without spending $30,000 a year in a degree that they're going to change in the first year. They got some exposure. Like if I don't like being around blood, at the veterinarian hospital, then I'm not going to go and enroll to be a veterinarian for $30,000 a year, for the first year and then change my major. And so it was really important for us to create those key partnerships. And then the other ones is just all the community partners, YMCA, Boys and Girls Clubs. I mean, there are people out there that are just thriving, wanting to get into the school system and wanting to partner, or they're actually having a hard time reaching the community just in their standalone siloed building. And so how are we creating those partnerships to have them come in and actually meet the students where they're at? And that's in the school.
Do you have anything that you want to add?
I'm going to challenge the group to think about territoriality and drop that idea, right? Because often, even when I was in the schools, it was like, well, if we bring them in, then what about our jobs? It's not about you versus me. It's about us. We're a community. So we used to work with adults in the community to be mentors to middle and elementary school. I used to work with in a very diverse community where 80% were Latino students. And we found in our PTA families, moms who spoke fluent Spanish, right? They were bilingual, who decided to open a welcome center for the families coming from Latin America and teach them about the library, how to dress your kids in the winter time.
Yeah.
How to not stand on the bus stop when it's negative 20 degrees out there. Because they were coming from South America. And so you start thinking about the needs and you start asking families, what would be important that we can help you? And there are people out there willing to help. We used to bring in community members during our lunch periods to talk about their careers, what they did. So we had a vet come in, we had, different careers, accountant, et cetera. And finally, during one year where it was very scarce for students to get jobs during the summer. The economy was not doing well. We created our first volunteer fair. So we brought in local organizations that kids could sign up to volunteer based on their interest or maybe a career or something of the sort. You start reinventing the wheel, but you have to stop this territoriality.
Well, absolutely. And as we are kind of coming near the end, if there's any questions that our colleagues that have been joining us want to ask, please, we've got just a few minutes. So please feel free to do that. I know that Deb and Matt's contact information have been shared in the chat box, and they would love to hear from you, as we would. So, please keep that in mind. And, some words that stand out for me in this conversation have been flexibility, resiliency, letting down, not being territorial, giving yourself kindness and grace as educators. But I want to leave it for you, Matt and Deb, to both say a couple of closing things. Like, as you think about this wonderful group of colleagues who've joined us, what do you wish them for the new school year?
Well, enjoy it. Enjoy the ride, no matter how chaotic it might be, like a roller coaster. But most importantly, just stay strong. Focus on yourself, self-care, because you can't help others without you feeling strong and confident and healthy.
Yeah, I would just say same thing that Deb said. You got to put on your you got to put on your mask, your air mask before you can put on anybody else's. And so make sure to be mindful of your self-care and your needs. But in the same regards, just have grace and be kind to yourself. Mistakes are going to happen. But thank you for everything you do. Yeah. You truly are a warrior. And we're so grateful to have you and grateful to have you advocating for students.
Well said.
Well, and I'll just close by saying thank you, Matt and Deb, for your gift of time.
Thank
and
you.
to our colleagues that joined us for you spending this hour with us. We look forward to future webinars that we will be doing throughout the new school year. And we share those on School Counselor Central, as well as to folks that are active on our mailing lists. And we hope that as topics come up that you want to be a part of, you will join us. So with that, we wish you a great start to the new school year. Thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of the day.